Welcome back to the Trad Living USA podcast. This is the podcast in which I hope to release a bunch of different information regarding traditional living, whether it be marriage, which I'm a young man and I'm just now learning a lot of this out for myself, but I do know what God has to say about it. So other topics I'd like to cover would be things like biblical manhood. Some of it I'm not going to claim to know everything about, but I am going to start figuring it out. Or I've already have started, but will continue to learn. I hope that you, if you're listening, will enjoy it and get something out of it. And start off, I'll apologize for the poor and low quality of the audio that we have currently. Maybe in time, but Lord willing, we'll be able to upgrade. But for the time being, we're going to hop right into what will probably be one of our first episodes. So, hope you enjoy it. So, welcome back. Today's episode is primarily going to be dealing with a broad variety of topics, just kind of touch on a few different things to kind of give you an idea of where we're going as a whole with this show. We're going to start off with this newly written article. It's just simply entitled Tradition. Now, tradition, some see it as essential to provide stability, while others see it as an anchor that holds us back. For quite some time, especially over the past few decades, we have seen a decrease in tradition, and that should come as no shock at all, considering that most of the English-speaking world has become embarrassed of our own history, whether it be English colonialism, the antebellum South, or westward expansion in relation to the Native Americans. But it has progressed so much more past those few topics that the people are embarrassed of. Any honorable or positive remark made about the past is now demonized. It's considered backwards and evil to the point where they are now, and have been for some time, rewriting histories, especially being implemented in the public school system. I'm very thankful. One of the few good things that has come from this so-called pandemic is the increase in homeschooling. Now, I wasn't homeschooled, but I went to a very blessed small country school, and I'll leave it at that. But anyway, as C.S. Lewis said, sometimes on the path to progress we have to realize the need to turn back when we have taken the wrong road. I think that's exactly where we are today in America. If we're not careful, we will become a people who have forgotten its path and abandoned its roots. A nation that forgets her history will soon be a nation that only exists in history. As Chesterton said, deep roots are not harmed by the frost. I believe that was Chesterton anyway. But when the oak is severed from its roots, the whole tree dies, leaving behind a stump of ruins and a nice decorative piece of merchandise that will either be used by someone else or simply cast into the fire. The decay of traditional values is evident, whether it be the sanctity of life, the sanctity of marriage, simple manners, how we greet one another, or how we treat the elderly, or the way we dress, the way we present ourselves physically to the rest of the world, is evidently proof of a moral decay. Now, don't get me wrong, degeneracy has always existed. But there used to be this idea of family values. There was entertainment created for families that showed family values. Whereas today we see that these family-friendly, quote-unquote, shows are now not quite so family-friendly anymore. Any mention of God is almost strictly forbidden in mainstream entertainment, and every popular show on Netflix has at least one sex scene every other episode. I'd actually just watched a video of, I forgot his name, but he was a rabbi, and he was talking with Dave Ramsey. If you don't know who Dave Ramsey is, he's a Christian man who helps people pretty much get out of debt and teaches you how to do that. He's a great guy, great content. But anyway, there's a guy who pretty much did the same thing, I guess, in a way. But anyway, and so he had a lot of friends in Hollywood. This rabbi did. Go figure. And so he noticed. He said all of the bad guys in all of the shows are these middle-class white men. And he asked, why is that? And well, all these producers pretty much came to the same answer. It says, well, they're the only ones who don't have a defense league. They're the only ones we can legally make fun of anymore. That's just a bit of an interesting thing that I didn't particularly notice, but Not surprised either way. But anyway, let's look at the nation of China. I'm not a big fan of the country, but look at how they've grown in strength over the past few years. During their Cultural Revolution back in the 60s, or better known as the Communist Revolution, the Chinese government tried to extinguish any positive mention of their past. And of course, Christian values and Christian worship was strictly forbidden. Yet, today they're implementing traditions within their public school systems. The teachings of their ancestors, such as Confucius, is now considered mandatory school curriculum. They have now banned any entertainment where male characters are portrayed as feminine. School children in high school are being taught life skills. Again, I'm not a fan of China. And I don't want America to become too much like China in so many areas, but we can't deny that their return to tradition has greatly impacted their country for the better. There must be a standard. There must be a predetermined moral code that is followed by the majority. But where do we get this standard? Where do we find this code? Well, for centuries we've looked back to our ancestors here in the West in order to maintain society. But where did they get these ideas and standards and rules for life? Yeah, there was some trial and error, don't get me wrong, but essentially the answer was very simple. It all stems from Christianity. The teachings of Jesus Christ and his apostles has shaped Western civilization. Without Jesus Christ, there would be no Western civilization. Jesus Christ is literally the most influential person in human history. I am a Christian who follows Jesus Christ. I believe he is fully man, fully God, the Son of God who died on the cross in propitiation for my sins and arose from the grave and ascended into heaven. And now he sits on the right hand of the Father. With that being said, even if you just view Jesus as a human being, now that's blasphemous, don't get me wrong, but let's say if you're listening and you're not a Christian, and that's all you view him as is just another man, you cannot deny the fact that he was the most influential person in human history. Look at what has been created in his name and in his honor. Why did most people of the West marry one person and stay with them for the rest of their lives, while Eastern cultures and pagan cultures had multiple spouses? Because of the teachings of Christ. Isn't it interesting that right around the time that the Roman Empire fell, first breaking in half and then, shattered in pieces across Europe, it appeared that Western civilization had died. Yet it didn't. Let's step back for a second, okay? Time and time again, we see this progression of events play out in the Bible. Now, the Bible is this incredible narrative. It's a chronological story that was written by God through men, the Word of God, penned by the hands of men, over the course of thousands of years. While a multitude of authors that all seem to be this piece to a puzzle that is now completed. We see the nation of ancient Israel would follow God and his word and his commandments and his traditions. And then the nation would prosper. They all had this moral code and a way of conducting society that most of the people agreed on, and it worked wonderfully. And after a time of power and strength and prosperity, they would become corrupt. Then a prophet would arise and warn the people of their wicked deeds. They would say things of, you're not taking care of the orphans, the widows, you're drinking, you're sleeping around too much, etc., etc. That's what society overall was doing. And this prophet would proclaim this God-given wisdom to the people, which normally fell on deaf ears. They ignored. Not to mention the prophet shared this message even though their lives or livelihoods were threatened. Yet, yet they preached the truth anyway. Then in time, the people of Israel would fall, time and time again, normally resulting in enslavement, being taken prisoner by other nations such as Babylon and Egypt. Or they faced great famines and wars and times of oppression. One interesting thing that we see in Isaiah chapter 3 is that when God punished the nation, he took the men away. He took the strong masculine role models away. Over time, fatherlessness increased. Soldiers became weak. Their warriors were killed. In fact, it even says that their warriors were like women among men. Their priests and governing leaders would die with no replacement. And those that took power were wicked rulers who did horrible things, or maybe they were just simply incompetent. It even says that women and children ruled over the few men that were left. Does this sound familiar? At the least bit familiar to you? Well, then in time the nation would learn from their mistakes. Then they would go back on track and honor God and follow His commandments and live well. They'd create strong families, strong communities, and life was grand. And then the cycle would start all over again. This happens literally several times within the scriptures. Read the prophets, read the book of Kings and Judges, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. You know that old saying, strong men create good times. Good times create strong men. Weak men create bad times. Bad times create strong men, and the cycle continues. Where do you think that came from? That didn't just pop up on, some social media posts in the past few years. That's a proven fact of life that has been happening for thousands of years. It's not new. But we so too soon forget the reality of it. We say things like, oh, that's the next generation's problem or the last generation's fault. Well, I don't care. We need to be the generation of people who realize the trouble that is coming, and then by God's grace, we can steer this back around. This is the focal point in which Western civilization was founded. When Rome fell due to their corruption, their sexual immorality, and their wicked ways, nations like Britain and France, Germany, and Spain picked up the torch. Except this time, they didn't build for Rome. They didn't build their nations for simple money or power or abundance of commodity. They built their nations for Jesus Christ. Without this central focus, nations crumble. A man by the name of Friedrich Nietzsche had a famous little writing called God is Dead. Now, that sounds blasphemous, but I encourage you to read it. He tells of how a society dies when they turn from God. It goes on to explain it was people who killed him. Not that God could be killed, but the belief in God and the adherence to His word had been killed. And the death of civilization would soon follow. Now keep in mind, this man was not a Christian, nor was he a follower of Christ. He had many arguments against our faith, yet he realized that Christianity was the bedrock in which Western civilization had been based on. And when you remove the foundation, the whole building crumbles. Nietzsche believed that mankind would have to become this godlike creature themselves that would create its own values and set its own standards and dictate their own way of conducting society. Interesting enough, many men have tried to do this, mostly the communists throughout history and even the Nazis. Look how well that turned out. But anyway, we see that Christ radically changed the world in its entirety, and particularly Western civilization. There was once a time when the followers of Christ were used as entertainment, when they were fed to lions in the Colosseums across the empire, burned in public display, not in the hopes of scaring others, simply that, but to entertain the masses. As Rome fell, Christianity arose. When the Christian values, such as the sanctity of human life, created in God's image, became more popularly accepted, the Colosseums began to close. When the Christian model of marriage became accepted, the practice of paganistic relations decreased. Women were considered almost like slaves to the Romans, and throughout most of the civilizations of the time, women were second-class citizens. Not even citizens, they were property. The idea of defiling a woman, if you know what I mean, wasn't even considered a crime in most places. And if it was because she was the property of someone else. It was a property crime. It wasn't a human rights violation. It wasn't considered rape. It was considered a property crime. But then we see the rise of Christianity, and that completely changed. Now, I'm not saying that people throughout history didn't care for one another on an individual basis. I'm sure to some level they did. But overall, the societal view of women was that lower than a second-class citizen. Where Christ taught husbands to love their wives, and that they should even be willing to die for them. Today we consider that pretty normal. Of course, husbands should love their wives and be willing to die for them, but for that time, that was not the norm at all. It was very revolutionary. So if you consider that idea normal, you can thank Jesus Christ and His influence on Western culture. The teachings of Christ influenced the public's view of sexual morality as a whole. That marriage was a union of two who would become one, between a loving husband and a loving wife. Homosexuality was rampant in Rome during its collapse, and that's no coincidence. Yet it all began to decline. The killing for entertainment, the sexual immorality, the emphasis on the family was now considered the norm. This was the greatest moral reform in human history. The teachings of Christ, did not only impact the West, of course, although it never took the majority in places such as India. In fact, in India, it was customary to burn widows at the stake when their husbands died, because they were his property. And when he died, she had to go too. Well, the Christian influence put a stop to that. Throughout Africa, when a chief would die, all of his wives and concubines would be killed with him, because they were his property. Again, Christ's influence, put an end to that. Jump forward roughly 1,000 years, we see the Spanish and French migrate to the New World. Upon arrival, they find that these people are performing human sacrifices. Some tribes even indulged in cannibalism. You don't see that happening very much anymore, do you? Why is that? Well, because of the teachings of Christ, and his standard was introduced into the New World. Was all of history hunky-dory and rainbows and butterflies? No. But we can't deny that Christ and his word had this major impact on Western civilization, not just Europe, but in all the colonies, in all of the New World, whether it be the United States, Canada, South America, Australia, places like that. In fact, another interesting fact is the word cannibalism was not in the English vocabulary until after the time of Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus, upon arrival in the New World, he met these people called the Tano tribe, and they were actually very peaceful, and they began to have great relations with Christopher Columbus's crew and the Tano tribe. Well, the Tano tribe warned Columbus of these other tribe, their neighboring tribe called the Canibs. The Canibs were cannibalists, and that's where we get the English word cannibal, was from that tribe. It was such a foreign concept to Europeans, especially in English language, that they didn't even have a word for it. You don't see that happening much more anymore, do we? Have you ever wondered where the idea of hospitals come from? For most of human history, only the elites, the rulers, and super wealthy could afford to pay a physician to heal them, and generally they didn't operate from a large building with hundreds of others. It was typically a man or a small group of men who would travel to rich people's houses. If you were poor, then you were pretty much just out of luck. It was the Christian teachings of healing, helping the poor, and tending to the needy that made the concept of a hospital a reality. Charity is the exact same thing. The idea of having an entire organization whose sole purpose is to help those in need was brought about by Christians. Orphanages and homes for the elderly all stem back to biblical teaching. Generally, it was all held within a church. Churches generally weren't just like, one big building. They would have multiple buildings and courtyards where they would do all these things. Such as, helping the poor, providing for them, elderly assisted living, things like that. It's all scripturally commanded, and it generally came out by churches, and then they would grow into organizations and things like that. The godless may scoff at the believers, and they'll look down on us. They'll make fun of us. Yet, they do so while enjoying all the things created by Christ through his church, not to mention all of creation itself. Again, all of these things seem so normal. Hospitals, charities, orphanages, elderly homes. But before Jesus Christ, this was almost unheard of. Truly a revolutionary idea. Now, unfortunately, many of these institutions have become corrupt, including churches. It's a sad fact, but a fact nonetheless. We now live in a consumer-driven, numbers-driven, greed-driven society, where every institution is viewed as a business and nothing more. We are now on that wrong road that C.S. Lewis talked about. We are now at the point where we need a modern-day prophet to arise to boldly proclaim the truth and warn the people of the things to come. We are on the verge of breaking point, where the men are weak and we are creating bad times. Men need to stand up. Yes. Yeah. You may lose your job. You may lose your social standing. You may lose your friends. For what profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his own soul? What's your soul worth? What's the world that your children will inherit worth? We get so busy keeping up with bills and building houses and getting a job and raising kids and trying to keep our heads above water, yet we notice this decline. We notice the evil we see every day. We shake our heads and we say, man, someone ought to do something about this. Anyone, do something, anyone, except for me. I'm guilty. What about you? The first thing, and probably the best thing you can do, is implement virtue into your own life. There is no virtue apart from Jesus Christ. I encourage you to introduce traditions into your life. If you're part of the Western world, then there's no way to escape Christ's impact. First thing to do is get to know Jesus Christ. Get to know Him on a personal level. Learn His Word. Learn His teachings. What does God say about family? What does God say about being a man? What does God say about taking care of your body? What does God say about life and society? And, excuse me, it's all in the Scriptures. That I can promise you. You want the world to be a better place, go home. Love your family. Don't have one? Prepare. Build one. And love them. Instill the traditions into them that weren't taught to you. And if you can't tell by my accent already, I'm from the South. Here in the South, we have our own culture, our own art, music, literature, architecture, clothing styles, music, food, dance, and just an all-around way of life. Not all of it is honoring to God, unfortunately. But God's influence is still here. When I travel to other parts of the country, I can always tell when I start getting closer to home. I start seeing more churches, more church signs, more anti-abortion signs, and the smell of better food. It still blows my mind that most of the country doesn't regularly serve sweet tea, but that's a whole other topic. I'm just rambling at this point, but I remember being in a boot store. There was a man there and his son, and they were from Rhode Island of all places, and he was buying up several pair of these boots. Not the, it's not the kind with laces. The Southern man doesn't wear those. And we got to talking, and he told me that in his area, you can't buy boots like this. It's unusual, and it never crossed my mind that even here in the U.S., there are people who didn't drink sweet tea regularly. They didn't wear leather boots as everyday footwear. I was so engulfed in my own culture that it was weird to think that others didn't do that. I never gave a second thought about the boots when I put them on in the morning. And it might sound silly, but now sometimes I look at them and I think that's a part of my culture, where I'm from, my land that I live. And the land that I do live on, my family's been here for over 200 years. I've been given a torch, and I have to carry it. Now, do I have to dress a certain way and eat a certain food and do all that? No, of course not. But then again, it's really neat to think and to realize that I do in fact have a culture and a way of living that is so different from other people. And I bet you do too. Again, you may think it sounds silly, but when you have faith in God, a family, and a community, and a culture, you have this whole new sense of belonging. And so many people have these things and they just don't know it. They're out there running so hard and they're looking and searching and doing whatever feels good in order to find contentment. If that's you, I encourage you to pray first and foremost. And if you really don't have the rest of these things, well, I encourage you to create them. Create a family, a community, and a culture. It's possible. It's not easy, but it's possible. And you may never see it come to completion, but God bless the men who plant trees whose shade and fruit they will never enjoy. Like I said, I jumped around on a lot of topics here, and I didn't really dive too deep into any of them, so I'm sorry if you found that confusing. I hope to dive deeper into some of these areas and topics as time goes on. I'm starting broad, and in time I'll narrow it down into specifics, Lord willing. Give me some feedback. Let me know what you think. Topic suggestions, questions, anything like that. Just hit me up.